After one of the most tumultuous weekends in Australian aviation history, Qantas planes are back in the air tonight following the grounding of the entire fleet on Saturday afternoon, leaving tens of thousands of travellers stranded. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce has been condemned for his shock decision to halt all international and domestic flights. But he says he had no choice and blames unrealistic union demands, which he says threaten the airline's existence. The unions say they're just trying to keep Australian jobs in Australia. Karen Barlow reports.
Back in the air.
All industrial action is now over and we have certainty.
Well, better late than never, we're here. Welcome aboard.
But for many disgruntled Qantas passengers, it's no longer the friendly skies.
Well, it doesn't really matter now. Everything's been mucked up. I've lost pretty much my week's work, and so I don't care anymore.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a further boarding call on Qantas flight 439.
After more than 48 hours on the ground, it's expected to be at least Wednesday before the entire Qantas fleet is back in action. For Qantas CEO Alan Joyce, it was a calculated risk.
And I think my determination to make sure we didn't capitulate to the union's demands, that we were building a stronger and better Qantas, was the right decision for Qantas.
Alan Joyce says he's been backed by the business community and staff members.
Nearly every major CEO in the country has given us a letter of support with the courageous decisions we've made to resolve this. I've been overwhelmed by the emails that's coming in.
The industrial umpire, Fair Work Australia, stopped the lockout early this morning, granting the federal government's application to terminate all industrial action to prevent further harm to the economy. The unions and Qantas now have to re-enter negotiations in good faith. It's a risk for both parties.
Qantas is now going to be held to account to have enforceable undertakings, which they refused to do on the 26th of October, by force of arbitration.
There is now a 21-day negotiation period under the umpire's watch.
If they don't reach agreement, then the Commission has the power to basically tell the parties what the actual outcome will be. Now, it's also said there's a further 21 days if the parties want it, and they can ask for that. But essentially now they're out of trying to hurt each other and into trying to reach a settlement.
Alan Joyce maintains he had no choice but to force the issue with the lockout, saying Qantas's survival was at risk. He says the union's industrial action and Qantas's two-day grounding have cost the airline more than $100 million. And there'll be more costs as the airline ramps back up to full operation. But the Qantas chief may have had another reason to force arbitration.
It's seriously in Qantas's interest to have it moved to arbitration now because you really limit the ambit of settlement.
Industrial changes brought in by the Howard government in 1996 limit the power of arbitration. Fair Work may not be able to make decisions on job security issues such as union demands for Qantas planes to be flown only by Qantas pilots, and for stipulations that only local engineers work on A380 engines.
Since 1996, the realm of management prerogative has been increasing, and it would be very surprising if the Industrial Relations Commission intruded on the management prerogative in these areas.
The unions say they're determined to make sure Australian jobs are kept within Australia.
Get rid of your ideology. Stop trying to send jobs offshore, and let's stick down to good faith bargaining and remember what made this Qantas brand so unique in the world.
So Qantas is back in the sky and it and the unions are talking again. There will be some sort of 3-year deal struck soon, but it may not be the end of the Flying Kangaroo's industrial problems.
There is a huge problem Qantas has now with its core workforce. I've seen this on the coalfields in the 1990s when similar disputes were held. The workforce loves their immediate workplace. In this case, they love the airline, but they have a deep mistrust of management. And you can sustain that for a while. In a service sector, if you've lost the trust of your workforce, you've got a serious problem.
The unions are still considering whether to appeal Fair Work Australia's decision to terminate the industrial action. Karen Barlow, Lateline.
As Qantas flights take to the skies again tonight, the political fallout is also up in the air. The dramatic escalation of what had already been a protracted industrial dispute is now the key test of the government's Fair Work system. Also at stake, perceptions of the Gillard government's ability to manage a crisis. Political correspondent Tommy Gooden reports.
After 48 hours of industrial chaos, the planes are back in the air.
The swift action the government took has brought the dispute to an end.
Not swift enough for Tony Abbott, who accuses the Prime Minister of dithering.
Why didn't she just pick up the phone to Alan Joyce and ask him not to ground the fleet? Was this too hard for you, Prime Minister?
I did act, and as a result, industrial action is at an end.
The opposition says the government could have ended the dispute more quickly because it should have seen the lockout coming. The government says the first it knew was when Qantas CEO Alan Joyce called 3 hours before he grounded the fleet.
He also indicated they would do that earlier if the information leaked, and that he was calling us as a courtesy call.
At first, Mr Joyce said he had told the government before then.
I said on multiple occasions we could get to a stage where we'd have to ground the airline. That's how bad this was, and that was made very clear.
Later, he backed off, suggesting there was no direct mention of the grounding before Saturday.
We made it very clear with various ministers that we could not survive for much longer. We made it very clear with various ministers that our operation and financial performance was such that this could not continue.
But the opposition already had the Transport Minister in its sights.
On how many occasions prior to 2 p.m. on Saturday did Qantas advise the Minister that if industrial unrest continued, it may have to ground its fleet?
Mr Joyce will confirm that on no occasion did Qantas ever raise the issue of a lockout of its workforce. Of a lockout of its workforce to myself or any other government minister.
Mr Joyce will verify that what Mr Albanese says is a correct account of their conversations.
Tony Abbott says the government's decision to use its independent Fair Work umpire cost valuable time.
Why didn't she immediately terminate this dispute without reference to a tribunal, as she could have under her Fair Work Act, thereby avoiding so much damage to hundreds of thousands of Australians?
But the Prime Minister says the government's role was to get unions and Qantas back to the bargaining table rather than directly intervene.
Indeed, in their days in office, the only time they intervened in industrial disputes with enthusiasm is when it was accompanied by dogs and balaclavas on the waterfront. Well, we stand for Fair Work and the Fair Work system, which is working. They stand for ripping off working people, and Mr Work Choices is shouting out his enthusiasm for doing that all over again.
But the Greens say the government's capitulated to Qantas management.
The government, in going to Fair Work Australia and seeking a termination rather than a suspension, has in fact delivered Alan Joyce exactly what he wanted. That is an excuse to avoid negotiations with the unions and the workers who are involved.
Like Julia Gillard, Adam Bance, a former industrial relations lawyer, and he says Fair Work's first major test has already set a bad precedent for future industrial disputes.
Put a gun to the head of the travelling public and then scream out, look what an awful situation this is, someone better step in and do something.